The autumn mist hung low over Chickamauga Creek on the morning of September 19, 1863, carrying with it the acrid scent of gunpowder and the desperate prayers of 60,000 men who knew that death walked among them. In the dense forests of northwestern Georgia, two armies prepared to unleash a fury that would transform a Cherokee word meaning river of death into a prophetic reality. General Braxton Bragg stood atop a slight rise, his weathered face etched with the weight of Confederate expectations. The Army of Tennessee, though battered from previous campaigns, represented the South's last substantial force in the Western theater. Behind him, the gray-clad soldiers of Lieutenant General James Longstreet's corps had arrived just days earlier, their Virginia accents mixing with the drawls of Tennessee and Georgia as they prepared for what many sensed would be a decisive engagement. Historical context referenced from Battles and Leaders of the Civil War, published by the Century Company. Across the creek, Major General William Rosecrans commanded the Union Army of the Cumberland, a force that had spent the summer maneuvering Bragg out of Tennessee through brilliant tactical movements. The Federal soldiers, many still dusty from their march through the Cumberland Gap, had grown confident in their commander's abilities. Yet Rosecrans himself harbored deep concerns about his scattered divisions, and the intelligence reports suggesting Confederate reinforcements were arriving by rail. The strategic importance of Chickamauga extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. Chattanooga, the gateway to the Deep South, lay just miles to the north. This vital railroad junction connected the Confederacy's eastern and western regions, making it perhaps the most critical logistical hub remaining in Southern hands. President Abraham Lincoln himself had emphasized to his generals that securing this prize could effectively cut the Confederacy in two, hastening the war's end. For the Confederate leadership, the stakes were equally momentous. General Robert E. Lee had reluctantly agreed to transfer Longstreet's seasoned veterans from Virginia, despite his own precarious position following the Gettysburg Campaign. This represented the largest troop movement by rail in American history to that point, with nearly 12,000 soldiers traveling over 900 miles in just 5 days. The gamble reflected Jefferson Davis's understanding that losing Chattanooga might doom the Confederate cause. The soldiers themselves carried personal stakes into battle that transcended grand strategy. Private Samuel Watkins of the 1st Tennessee Infantry had already survived Shiloh and Stone's River, writing in his diary that he feared this engagement might be his last. His counterpart in the 20th Corps, Corporal James Mitchell of the 104th Illinois Infantry, penned a letter to his wife expressing similar premonitions while describing the eerie quiet that had settled over the Federal camps. The Cherokee had named this region well. Chickamauga Creek wound through some of the most difficult terrain in the South, where thick forests of oak and pine created natural barriers that would channel the coming battle into a series of desperate, close-quarters engagements. The dense undergrowth meant that commanders would lose visual contact with their units within minutes of engagement, turning tactical control into an exercise in hope and prayer. As the first rays of September sunlight penetrated the canopy, both armies began their final preparations. Artillery batteries wheeled into position along the ridge lines, their bronze Napoleon cannons gleaming dully in the filtered light. Infantry regiments formed up in the clearings, battle flags snapping in the morning breeze as chaplains offered final benedictions to men who understood that many would not see another sunset. The irony was not lost on the more historically minded officers that they were about to fight one of the war's bloodiest battles in a place whose very name predicted its outcome. The Cherokee, who had once called this land home, had been driven westward on the Trail of Tears just 25 years earlier, another tragic chapter in America's expansion. Now, their ancient hunting grounds would witness a different kind of tragedy as Americans turned their weapons upon each other with unprecedented ferocity. The stage was set for a battle that would claim more casualties than any previous engagement in the Western theater, a victory so costly that it would ultimately contribute to Confederate defeat. Dawn broke over Chickamauga Creek with deceptive tranquility on September 19, 1863. But within hours, the forest would echo with the thunderous roar of what would become the largest battle fought in Georgia during the entire Civil War. The morning mist that had shrouded the Confederate positions began to lift just as Brigadier General John Croxton's Union cavalry encountered Confederate infantry advancing through the dense woodland near Reed's Bridge. The first shots rang out at approximately 7:30 in the morning, shattering the autumn silence and setting in motion a chain of engagements that would consume the entire day. General Braxton Bragg's battle plan called for his right wing, commanded by Lieutenant General Leonidas Polk, to cross Chickamauga Creek at multiple points and roll up the Union left flank. However, the thick forest and poor visibility immediately began to disrupt Confederate coordination, a problem that would plague both armies throughout the engagement. Brigadier General Nathan Bedford Forrest, the Confederate cavalry commander whose tactical genius had earned him a fearsome reputation throughout the Western theater, led his mounted units across Alexander's Bridge in the pre-dawn darkness. His troopers had been screening Bragg's movements for days, and now they found themselves in the unusual position of fighting dismounted among the trees. Forrest himself would later describe the terrain as the worst possible ground for cavalry operations, forcing his men to abandon their traditional mobility advantage. Historical documentation from the official records of the War of the Rebellion compiled by the U.S. War Department. On the Union side, Major General George Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga, whose steadfast defense would later save the Army of the Cumberland from complete destruction, positioned his 14th Corps along the Lafayette Road. Thomas had earned his soldiers' complete trust through previous campaigns, and they responded with disciplined formations, even as Confederate pressure mounted throughout the morning hours. His veteran regiments, many from Ohio and Indiana, had learned to fight effectively in heavy timber from their experiences at Stone's River. The battle's opening phase revealed the communication difficulties that would characterize the entire engagement. General Rosecrans, operating from his headquarters near the Widow Glenn's cabin, struggled to maintain contact with his scattered divisions as the fighting spread along a front stretching nearly 4 miles. Courier routes became increasingly dangerous as Confederate sharpshooters infiltrated the Federal rear areas, and the dense forest made visual signals impossible. Lieutenant General Leonidas Polk, commanding the Confederate right wing, found his attack plans falling apart almost immediately. His divisions, led by Major Generals Benjamin Cheatham and Simon Buckner, became separated in the thick undergrowth, and what should have been a coordinated assault dissolved into a series of piecemeal attacks. The veteran soldiers of both armies quickly adapted to the conditions, fighting in small unit actions that resembled wilderness skirmishing more than traditional Civil War battles. The human cost of these morning engagements became apparent within the first few hours. The 15th Alabama Infantry, advancing through a particularly dense thicket, lost nearly 100 men to Union rifle fire before they could even locate their enemy's position. Across the lines, the 94th Ohio Infantry suffered similar casualties as they attempted to maintain their positions against repeated Confederate probes. Artillery played a limited role in these early exchanges due to the terrain constraints, but when batteries did find suitable positions, their impact was devastating. Captain Lilly's 18th Indiana Battery, positioned on a slight rise near the Brotherton cabin, poured canister rounds into Confederate formations as they emerged from the tree line, creating scenes of carnage that would haunt survivors for decades. By mid-morning, both commanders realized that their original battle plans required significant modification. The forest had imposed its own tactical requirements, favoring defensive positions and making large-scale maneuvers nearly impossible. What had begun as an attempt at strategic flanking movements was rapidly evolving into a brutal slugging match between veteran armies operating under the worst possible conditions. The Cherokee name for this place was proving prophetic as the morning sun climbed higher over a battlefield already soaked in American blood. As the morning fighting raged along Chickamauga Creek, the distant whistle of locomotive engines announced the arrival of reinforcements that would fundamentally alter the battle's trajectory. Lieutenant General James Longstreet, Robert E. Lee's old war horse, stepped from a Confederate transport train at Catoosa Station with the advance elements of his First Corps, bringing seasoned Virginia veterans to a Western theater engagement for the first time in the war. Longstreet's journey from Virginia represented a logistical marvel that demonstrated the Confederacy's remaining organizational capabilities despite mounting resource constraints. Nearly 12,000 soldiers had traveled over 900 miles through the Carolinas and Georgia, utilizing railroads that were already straining under wartime demands. The movement had required coordination between 5 different railroad companies, with Confederate transportation officials working around the clock to manage rolling stock and maintain schedules. The psychological impact of these Eastern Theater veterans on both armies proved immediate and significant. Confederate soldiers who had been fighting a defensive campaign for months suddenly found themselves reinforced by the survivors of Gettysburg, men whose reputations preceded them throughout the South. Conversely, Union forces that had grown accustomed to facing the Army of Tennessee now confronted an unknown quantity in Longstreet's battle-hardened divisions. Military analysis drawn from the Army of Tennessee by Stanley Horn, University of Oklahoma Press. General Bragg met with Longstreet near the Catoosa Depot, their conference taking place amid the controlled chaos of troop deployment. The two generals had never worked together previously, and their differing tactical philosophies became apparent immediately. Bragg favored detailed, complex battle plans that required precise timing and coordination. Longstreet, seasoned by campaigns with Lee, preferred simpler concepts that allowed subordinate commanders greater flexibility in execution. The Confederate command structure reflected this tension. Longstreet's corps included Major General John Bell Hood's division and Major General Lafayette McLaws' division, both units, that had distinguished themselves in Virginia campaigns. These commanders brought tactical experience from battles like Second Manassas and Antietam, engagements that had taught them to exploit enemy weaknesses with aggressive pursuit and concentration of force. Hood himself, despite suffering a severe arm wound at Gettysburg just 2 months earlier, had insisted on accompanying his division to Georgia. The young general's aggressive leadership style had earned him the nickname the Gallant Hood among his soldiers, who followed him with the kind of devotion that could turn tactical situations into strategic victories. His presence on the Chickamauga battlefield added another unpredictable element to an already complex engagement. The integration of Eastern and Western Confederate forces created immediate challenges. Longstreet's soldiers used different bugle calls, carried equipment manufactured in Virginia rather than Alabama or Georgia, and spoke with accents that marked them as outsiders to the Army of Tennessee. These cultural differences might have seemed trivial, but in the confusion of battle, they could lead to fatal miscommunications between friendly units. Union intelligence had detected the railroad movements, but General Rosecrans underestimated both the speed and scale of Confederate reinforcements. Federal cavalry scouts reported increased train activity, but the dense forest around Chickamauga Creek prevented accurate assessment of enemy strength. Rosecrans continued to believe he faced only Bragg's Army of Tennessee, a dangerous miscalculation that would influence his tactical decisions throughout the battle. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the Georgia pines as Longstreet completed his reconnaissance of the battlefield. Unlike many Eastern theater engagements, Chickamauga offered few commanding heights or clear fields of fire. Instead, the fighting would occur in dense woodland where traditional artillery deployments were impossible and infantry formations would be broken up by the terrain itself. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Longstreet had positioned his corps on the Confederate left wing, directly opposite the Union right where General Thomas Wood's division held positions that appeared vulnerable to concentrated assault. The stage was set for the tactical stroke that would transform a hard-fought battle into a Confederate victory, though one purchased at a price that the South could ill afford. The veterans from Virginia were about to teach the Western armies a lesson in offensive warfare that would resonate far beyond the banks of Chickamauga Creek. September 20th dawned with a crisp clarity that seemed to mock the confusion and carnage of the previous day. The morning sun filtered through the smoke-stained forest canopy as both armies prepared for what commanders on both sides recognized would be a decisive engagement. General William Rosecrans, operating from his headquarters at the Widow Glen's cabin, faced a tactical puzzle that would soon become a strategic catastrophe. The Union line stretched precariously along a 4-mile front, with divisions positioned according to hasty overnight assessments rather than careful reconnaissance. Rosecrans had spent the night reorganizing his forces, attempting to create a cohesive defensive position from units that had fought independently throughout the previous day's engagements. His greatest concern centered on his left flank, where General George Thomas faced mounting Confederate pressure from Bragg's reinforced right wing. At approximately 10:30 in the morning, Rosecrans received a report that would alter American history. General Thomas Wood, commanding a division positioned in the Union center, received orders to close up on Reynolds and support him. This message, transmitted through the standard chain of command during active combat operations, contained a fatal ambiguity that Wood interpreted as an instruction to withdraw his entire division from the line. Wood's division had been positioned between General John Brannan's troops on the left and General Philip Sheridan's division on the right, forming a crucial link in the Union defensive chain. When Wood ordered his men to march toward General John Reynolds's position, approximately 3/4 of a mile to the north, he inadvertently created a gap nearly half a mile wide in the Federal center. The movement took nearly 30 minutes to complete, during which time Confederate reconnaissance detected the developing weakness. Tactical analysis based on reports from battles and leaders of the Civil War, the Century magazine, 1887. Lieutenant General James Longstreet, positioned with his Virginia veterans directly opposite Wood's former position, recognized the opportunity with the instincts of a predator. His corps had been formed for attack since dawn, with Major General John Bell Hood's division positioned for maximum impact against what appeared to be the strongest section of Union line. The sudden appearance of an undefended gap transformed a planned frontal assault into a potential war-winning maneuver. Hood's Texans and Georgians advanced through the forest with the disciplined precision that had made them feared throughout Virginia campaigns. The 1st Texas Infantry, survivors of bloody engagements from Gaines's Mill to Gettysburg, moved through the dense undergrowth with practiced stealth, their battle-scarred flags hanging limp in the still morning air. Behind them, artillery batteries wheeled forward to exploit the breakthrough once infantry secured the initial penetration. The Confederate assault struck the exposed Union flank with devastating effectiveness. General Philip Sheridan's division, suddenly finding Confederate forces attacking from an unexpected direction, began a fighting withdrawal that quickly deteriorated into a rout. Federal regiments that had maintained cohesion throughout the previous day's fighting found themselves surrounded and cut off from their supply lines and command structure. General Rosecrans himself nearly fell victim to the Confederate breakthrough. As Hood's forces poured through the gap, they overran Federal headquarters positions that had been considered safely behind the lines. The Union commander, forced to flee on horseback toward Chattanooga, lost direct communication with more than half his army during the most critical phase of the battle. His departure from the field created a command vacuum that might have led to complete Union disaster. The human cost of Longstreet's assault became apparent within minutes of the breakthrough. The 20th Tennessee Infantry, advancing alongside Hood's Texans, encountered the 74th Indiana Infantry in a savage hand-to-hand engagement that left both units decimated. Federal artillery, unable to retreat quickly enough through the forest, fell into Confederate hands along with their crews, adding desperately needed guns to Bragg's limited artillery park. By noon on September 20th, the Battle of Chickamauga had reached its turning point. Confederate forces controlled the Lafayette Road, the primary Union supply route, and had split the Army of the Cumberland into two separate fighting forces. Only the steadfast defense of General George Thomas on the Union left prevented complete Federal collapse, earning him immortal fame as the Rock of Chickamauga. As Confederate forces poured through the gap in the Union center, transforming tactical advantage into strategic dominance, one man stood between General Bragg's army and complete victory. Major General George Henry Thomas, a Virginian who had remained loyal to the Union despite enormous personal cost, anchored the remnants of Federal resistance on Snodgrass Hill with a determination that would earn him eternal fame in American military history. Thomas had spent the morning of September 20th preparing for what he sensed would be a desperate defensive action. His 14th Corps, positioned on the Union left wing, had been under constant pressure since dawn from Confederate forces commanded by Lieutenant General Leonidas Polk. The veteran general, whose methodical approach to warfare had earned him the nickname, the Sledgehammer of Nashville, understood that military disasters often created opportunities for military immortality. The collapse of the Union center around noon created a tactical situation unprecedented in Thomas's experience. Federal units streaming northward from the breakthrough brought reports of complete Confederate victory, claims that Rosecrans had fled the field, and desperate pleas for permission to retreat toward Chattanooga. Lesser commanders might have succumbed to the panic that was spreading through Union ranks, but Thomas possessed the rare combination of tactical skill and personal courage that distinguished great generals from merely competent ones. Historical accounts drawn from The Life of George H. Thomas by Thomas Van Horn, Charles Scribner's Sons, 1882. Thomas's defensive position on Snodgrass Hill offered significant tactical advantages that the general quickly recognized and exploited. The elevated ground provided clear fields of fire across the approaches from the south and east, while the dense forest on the flanks limited Confederate ability to coordinate large-scale flanking movements. More importantly, the hill controlled access to the primary escape routes toward Rossville and Chattanooga, making it essential terrain that could not be abandoned without ensuring complete Federal disaster. The units that rallied around Thomas represented a cross-section of Union military culture. The 19th Illinois Infantry, veterans of Shiloh and Stones River, took positions alongside the 8th Kansas Infantry, a regiment that had learned warfare on the bleeding Kansas frontier before the war began. These soldiers, many of whom had never served together previously, found common cause in their trust of Thomas and their understanding that retreat meant surrender of everything they had fought to preserve. Confederate pressure intensified throughout the afternoon as General Bragg recognized that destroying Thomas's position would complete his victory and potentially end Union presence in Tennessee. Wave after wave of gray-clad infantry charged up Snodgrass Hill, their battle cries echoing through the forest as they attempted to dislodge defenders who had nowhere left to retreat. The fighting devolved into the most primitive form of combat, with soldiers using bayonets, rifle butts, and even stones when ammunition ran low. The human drama on Snodgrass Hill transcended military tactics. Captain William Carlin of the 38th Illinois Infantry later described watching Thomas move among his men during the heaviest Confederate assaults, the general's calm presence providing psychological reinforcement that proved as valuable as physical ammunition. Thomas had lost his horse to Confederate fire early in the afternoon, but continued to direct the defense on foot, his tall figure visible to soldiers who drew courage from his example. Artillery played a crucial role in Thomas's defensive success. Captain Elijah Standart's Battery B, 1st Ohio Light Artillery, had fought its way to Snodgrass Hill during the Union retreat and now provided the firepower necessary to break up Confederate assault formations before they could close with Federal infantry. The battery's 6 Napoleon cannons, loaded with canister rounds, designed for close-range defensive work, created killing zones that channeled Confederate attacks into predictable patterns. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the battlefield, Thomas faced a critical decision regarding the timing of his withdrawal. His position remained tenable as long as ammunition lasted, but Federal supply lines had been severed by the Confederate breakthrough. Union scouts reported that escape routes toward Rossville remained open, but only for a limited time before Confederate forces could complete their encirclement of the hill. The Rock of Chickamauga was about to demonstrate that strategic retreats sometimes required more courage than desperate advances. As the sun set over Chickamauga Creek on September 20th, 1863, the Confederate Army of Tennessee held the field in what appeared to be its greatest victory of the war. Yet even as General Braxton Bragg surveyed the captured Union positions along the Lafayette Road, the staggering cost of his triumph was becoming apparent. The blood-soaked forest bore witness to casualties that the Confederacy could ill afford, losses that would ultimately contribute to Southern defeat despite immediate tactical success. The human cost of Chickamauga exceeded that of any previous Western theater engagement, with Confederate forces suffering approximately 18,000 casualties over 2 days of fighting. These losses fell particularly heavily on the veteran units that formed the backbone of Bragg's army. The 1st Tennessee Infantry, which had served with distinction since Shiloh, entered the battle with 420 men and emerged with fewer than 200 effective soldiers. Similar devastation afflicted regiments throughout the Army of Tennessee, creating gaps in unit structure that would never be adequately filled. Lieutenant General James Longstreet's 1st Corps, despite achieving the tactical breakthrough that secured Confederate victory, paid an enormous price for their success. Major General John Bell Hood, the aggressive division commander whose assault had shattered Union resistance, suffered a severe leg wound that would require amputation and effectively end his field career. The loss of such dynamic leadership represented a strategic blow that extended far beyond immediate battlefield considerations, depriving the Confederacy of one of its most capable offensive commanders. Casualty figures compiled from Numbers and Losses in the Civil War in America by Thomas Leonard Livermore, Houghton Mifflin Company, 1890. The officer casualties among Confederate forces reflected the intensity of the fighting and the personal leadership style that characterized Southern military culture. Brigadier General Benjamin Hardin Helm, President Lincoln's brother-in-law, who had chosen Confederate service despite family pressure, fell leading his Kentucky Brigade in the final assault on Union positions. His death symbolized the fratricidal nature of the conflict, while depriving the Confederacy of a promising young commander who might have provided the kind of tactical innovation that could have altered later campaigns. Medical facilities throughout northwestern Georgia struggled to cope with the unprecedented number of wounded soldiers requiring immediate treatment. Confederate surgeons, already operating under severe supply constraints, found themselves performing amputations and emergency procedures with inadequate anesthesia and surgical instruments. The primitive medical understanding of the era meant that soldiers who survived their wounds often succumbed to infection and disease in the weeks following the battle, adding to casualty figures that continued mounting long after the guns fell silent. The strategic implications of Confederate casualties at Chickamauga extended beyond immediate numerical losses to encompass long-term military sustainability. The Army of Tennessee represented the Confederacy's last major field force capable of offensive operations in the Western theater. Each veteran soldier lost at Chickamauga could not be replaced with an equally experienced man, forcing Confederate commanders to rely increasingly on hastily trained recruits and militia units that lacked the tactical proficiency necessary for complex operations. General Bragg himself recognized the Pyrrhic nature of his victory, reportedly commenting to his staff that another such triumph would destroy his army entirely. The Confederate commander understood that his forces had reached the limits of their offensive capability, a recognition that would influence his subsequent decisions during the Chattanooga campaign. The psychological impact on Confederate soldiers was equally significant, as men who had expected decisive victory found themselves counting losses that seemed disproportionate to territorial gains achieved. The weapons technology of 1863 contributed significantly to the casualty figures at Chickamauga. Rifled muskets like the Springfield Model, 1857, capable of accurate fire at ranges exceeding 400 yards, created killing zones that made traditional infantry assaults prohibitively expensive. Confederate forces, attacking prepared Union positions throughout much of the battle, suffered disproportionately from defensive firepower that previous generations of soldiers had never encountered. The victory at Chickamauga would prove to be the Confederacy's last major offensive success in the Western theater, purchased at a cost that ensured subsequent defensive operations would be conducted with inadequate manpower and increasingly limited resources. The dead of both armies lay scattered through Georgia forests that would forever bear witness to American tragedy. The darkness that fell over Chickamauga Creek on the night of September 20th, 1863, cloaked one of the most skillful military withdrawals in American history. General George Thomas, having held Snodgrass Hill throughout the afternoon against repeated Confederate assaults, now faced the delicate task of extracting his forces from their defensive positions without triggering a complete rout that would destroy the remnants of the Army of the Cumberland. Thomas's withdrawal began at approximately 6 o'clock in the evening, timed to coincide with the onset of darkness that would screen Federal movements from Confederate observation. The general had spent precious daylight hours organizing a defense in depth that would allow successive units to cover each other's retreat while maintaining sufficient cohesion to prevent panic among soldiers who had witnessed their army's near destruction. His methodical approach to the evacuation reflected the same tactical principles that had enabled his defensive success throughout the day. The retreat route toward Chattanooga presented numerous challenges that tested Union organizational capabilities under the most adverse conditions. The primary roads, particularly the Lafayette Road and the Rossville Gap Passage, were clogged with abandoned equipment, wounded soldiers, and civilian refugees who had fled their homes as the battle approached. Federal engineers worked desperately to clear paths for artillery pieces and ammunition wagons that could not be abandoned without ensuring Confederate access to desperately needed military supplies. Tactical analysis based on official reports in The War of the Rebellion, official records, compiled by the United States War Department. General William Rosecrans, having fled the battlefield during the Confederate breakthrough, established his headquarters in Chattanooga and began organizing defensive positions to receive Thomas's retreating forces. The Union commander's departure from Chickamauga had created a temporary command vacuum that might have proven disastrous under different circumstances, but Thomas's steady leadership provided the continuity necessary to prevent complete military collapse. The psychological state of Union soldiers during the retreat reflected their complex understanding of the battle's outcome. Veterans who had witnessed Confederate success understood that they had suffered a significant defeat, yet Thomas's defensive stand had preserved their unit's organizational integrity and prevented the kind of complete rout that destroys armies permanently. Many soldiers drew renewed confidence from their commander's example, recognizing that military disasters could be survived through disciplined leadership and collective determination. Confederate pursuit of the retreating Federal forces proved limited and ineffective, a failure that would have strategic consequences extending far beyond immediate battlefield considerations. General Bragg, despite having achieved tactical victory, hesitated to authorize aggressive pursuit that might have completed the destruction of Union forces in Tennessee. His decision reflected both the exhaustion of Confederate troops after 2 days of intensive combat and his characteristic caution in exploiting tactical advantages. The Federal retreat became a race against time as Confederate cavalry units, led by General Nathan Bedford Forrest, attempted to interdict Union escape routes before organized resistance could establish itself in Chattanooga's defensive perimeter. Forrest's troopers, among the most effective cavalry forces in either army, harassed Federal rear guards throughout the night march, capturing stragglers and abandoned equipment while maintaining pressure that prevented any pause for reorganization. Union medical personnel faced particular challenges during the withdrawal. as wounded soldiers required transportation that competed with artillery and ammunition for limited wagon space. Field hospitals that had been established behind Union lines during the battle now lay within Confederate territory, forcing Federal surgeons to abandon patients who could not be moved safely. These decisions, necessary under the circumstances, would haunt medical officers for years after the war's conclusion. The arrival of Thomas's forces in Chattanooga during the early morning hours of September 21st marked the end of immediate Confederate threats to Federal positions in Tennessee, but also the beginning of a siege that would test Union resolve throughout the autumn months. Federal soldiers, exhausted from combat and retreat, found themselves occupying defensive positions that controlled access to vital railroad connections linking Union-held territory with supply bases in the North. The retreat from Chickamauga demonstrated that military defeats need not become military disasters when conducted under competent leadership, a lesson that would prove valuable during subsequent Union operations throughout the South. The Battle of Chickamauga concluded with Confederate forces controlling the field, but victory's long-term consequences would prove as complex and contradictory as the engagement itself. Within 6 months of Bragg's triumph, the Army of Tennessee would suffer devastating defeats at Missionary Ridge and Lookout Mountain, beginning an irreversible decline that would culminate in total Confederate collapse in the Western Theater. The costly victory at Chickamauga had purchased temporary tactical success at the expense of strategic sustainability, a trade that the Confederacy could not afford to make repeatedly. The immediate aftermath of the battle saw President Jefferson Davis traveling from Richmond to Georgia to assess the strategic situation personally. His visit to Bragg's headquarters in October 1863 revealed the deep fissures within Confederate command structure that victory had temporarily concealed but not resolved. Senior officers, including Lieutenant General James Longstreet and Major General Nathan Bedford Forrest, openly criticized Bragg's failure to exploit tactical success through aggressive pursuit of retreating Federal forces. These command disputes reflected broader problems within Confederate military organization that extended far beyond individual personality conflicts. The Army of Tennessee had never achieved the kind of unified command structure that characterized Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, and success at Chickamauga had paradoxically intensified these divisions by raising expectations that subsequent events would fail to meet. The Confederate military system, dependent on individual initiative and personal relationships rather than institutional structures, proved inadequate for sustained campaign management. Command analysis drawn from Jefferson Davis and his generals by Stephen Woodworth, University Press of Kansas, 1998. The battle's impact on Union military development proved equally significant, but ultimately more positive for Federal war aims. General George Thomas's defensive stand at Snodgrass Hill demonstrated that Confederate forces, despite their tactical superiority, could be contained through disciplined defensive operations that maximized defensive firepower advantages. This lesson would prove crucial during subsequent operations around Chattanooga, where Union forces would apply these principles on a larger scale. President Abraham Lincoln's response to Chickamauga reflected his growing understanding of military necessity and political reality. Within days of receiving news of Rosecrans's defeat, Lincoln authorized the transfer of 2 corps from the Army of the Potomac to reinforce Federal positions in Tennessee. This decision, involving the largest troop movement in American history to that point, demonstrated the Union's superior logistical capabilities while highlighting the integrated nature of Federal military planning. The psychological impact of Chickamauga on both armies extended far beyond immediate military considerations. Confederate soldiers, despite their tactical victory, recognized that they had failed to achieve the kind of decisive success that might have altered the war's trajectory. The enormous casualties suffered during the battle, particularly among veteran units, created morale problems that would persist throughout subsequent campaigns. Many soldiers understood intuitively that the Confederacy could not sustain such losses indefinitely while maintaining effective military operations. Union forces, conversely, drew important lessons from their defeat that would influence tactical development throughout the war's final phases. The experience of fighting in dense forest terrain against veteran Confederate infantry provided Federal commanders with insights into defensive operations that would prove valuable during the Atlanta campaign and Sherman's march to the sea. Thomas's example at Snodgrass Hill became a model for defensive leadership that inspired Union officers throughout the Western theater. The battle's historical significance extends beyond immediate military consequences to encompass broader themes in American development. Chickamauga represented the last major Confederate offensive success in the Western theater, marking a turning point after which Southern forces would fight an increasingly defensive war against superior Union resources. The engagement demonstrated both the tactical excellence of Confederate armies and their strategic inability to convert battlefield victories into war-winning advantages. Modern military historians continue to study Chickamauga as an example of the complex relationship between tactical success and strategic failure. The battle's lessons regarding command coordination, logistical planning, and the importance of exploiting battlefield success remain relevant to contemporary military planning, ensuring that the Cherokee word for "river of death" continues to echo through American military education. The soldiers who fought at Chickamauga, both Union and Confederate, had participated in an engagement that would influence the war's outcome while claiming lives that could never be recovered or replaced.